Amin Ahsan Islahi's early life and education. The story of Amin Ahsan Islahi begins in the quiet, unassuming village of Bamho, nestled in the fertile lands of Azamgarh, in the northern reaches of India. Born in the year 1904, he arrived in a world still shaped by the fading echoes of colonial rule, where traditional Islamic scholarship remained a beacon of knowledge and moral guidance. His family, though not wealthy, was deeply rooted in religious piety, and it was in this atmosphere of devotion that young Amin Ahsan took his first steps toward a life of learning. From his earliest days, there was something different about him, a quiet intensity, a hunger for understanding that set him apart from other children. While boys his age played in the fields or engaged in the simple pastimes of rural life, he was drawn to the mosque, to the rhythmic recitations of the Quran, and to the wise men who could unravel its meanings. His father, a man of modest means but firm faith, recognized this inclination and ensured that his son received the foundational education expected of a Muslim child, reading, writing, and memorizing the Quran. But even then, it was clear that young Amin Ahsan was not content with mere repetition. He wanted to understand, to grasp the deeper truths behind the words. By the time he reached adolescence, his reputation as a bright and serious student had grown. The local scholars, often custodians of centuries-old teaching traditions, noticed his sharp mind and his ability to absorb complex ideas with remarkable ease. He studied Arabic grammar, the science of tajweed, proper Quranic recitation, and the basics of hadith under their guidance. Yet, despite the rigor of these early lessons, there was a sense that the traditional methods, focused on rote memorization and fragmented explanations, left him unsatisfied. He yearned for a more coherent approach, one that treated the Quran not as a collection of isolated verses but as a unified, living message. This intellectual restlessness led him, in his late teens, to a turning point that would define the rest of his life. He heard of a remarkable scholar, Imam Hamiduddin Farahi, who was pioneering a revolutionary way of understanding the Quran, one based on the idea that each surah was a carefully structured discourse with a central theme, rather than a random assortment of verses. Intrigued, Islahi sought admission to Farahi's institute, Madrasat-ul-Islah, in Sari Mir, Azamgarh. The moment he stepped into that scholarly environment, he knew he had found his true teacher. Farahi was no ordinary instructor, he was a visionary who challenged centuries of conventional exegesis. His method, known as a Nazm-ul-Quran, the thematic coherence of the Quran, argued that the divine text was meticulously arranged, with every word, every passage, serving a deliberate purpose in the larger message. For young Islahi, this was a revelation. Under Farahi's mentorship, he didn't just learn, he awakened. The Quran, which he had revered since childhood, now unfolded before him in a new light, its intricate connections and profound wisdom becoming clearer with each lesson. The bond between teacher and student was profound, almost spiritual. Farahi saw in Islahi not just a gifted pupil but a kindred spirit, one who could carry forward his legacy. Islahi, in turn, devoted himself entirely to mastering his teacher's methodology, spending long hours in study, discussion, and reflection. He absorbed Farahi's teachings like parched earth soaking up rain, internalizing the principles that would later shape his own monumental contributions to Quranic scholarship. Yet, this period was not just about intellectual growth, it was also a time of personal transformation. Islahi's years at Madrasat-ul-Islah instilled in him a discipline that went beyond academia. He learned that true understanding of the Quran required not just a sharp mind but a purified heart. Farahi emphasized tazkiyah, self-purification, alongside tafakkur, reflection, teaching that knowledge without moral integrity was hollow. This holistic approach left an indelible mark on Islahi, shaping him into a scholar who sought wisdom not for prestige but for divine closeness. By the end of the 1920s, as he approached his late 20s, Amin Ahsan Islahi was no longer the curious village boy who had first arrived at Madrasat-ul-Islah. He had become a thinker of rare depth, a disciple molded by one of the era's greatest minds, and a man ready to embark on a lifelong mission to illuminate the Quran's coherence for generations to come. The seeds of his future works, his exegesis, his reforms, his spiritual insights, were all sown in these formative years. And though he could not have known it then, the path he walked would one day influence countless seekers of truth, leaving a legacy far beyond the humble beginnings of Bamho. This was the essence of his early journey, a fusion of innate curiosity, divine guidance, and the mentorship of a teacher who saw in him a flame worth nurturing. It was a quiet beginning, but one that carried within it the promise of something extraordinary. For Amin Ahsan Islahi, the Quran was not just a book to be studied, it was a companion for life, a guide to be lived, and a mystery to be unraveled with both the mind and the soul. And it all started in those early years, in the shadow of a small village mosque, where a boy with a questioning heart first listened to the words of God and dared to seek their deepest meaning. Amin Ahsan Islahi's mentorship under Hamiduddin Farahi and intellectual formation. The moment Amin Ahsan Islahi stepped into the scholarly circle of Imam Hamiduddin Farahi, he entered a world where the Quran was not merely recited or memorized, but experienced as a living, breathing revelation. This was not the dry, fragmented study of verses he had encountered in traditional settings. This was a journey into the very soul of the divine text, where every word carried weight, every passage held purpose, and every surah unfolded like a perfectly composed symphony of guidance. The years between the early 1920s and 1930, though brief in the span of a lifetime, became the crucible in which Islahi's intellect, spirituality, and lifelong mission were forged. When Islahi first arrived at Madrasatul Islah in Sari Mir, he was a young man of sharp mind and earnest heart, but it was Farahi who recognized in him the potential for something far greater. The teacher-student relationship that blossomed between them was not the usual dynamic of lectures and rote learning, it was a meeting of souls, a transmission of vision. Farahi, already a towering figure in Islamic scholarship, had developed a revolutionary approach to understanding the Quran, Nazm-ul-Quran, the principle of thematic coherence. He taught that the Quran was not a disjointed collection of commandments and stories, but a meticulously structured revelation where each surah was a unified discourse, with its own central theme, logical flow, and profound interconnections. To young Islahi, this was nothing short of a revelation. The Quran, which he had always revered, now revealed itself to him in layers of meaning he had never before imagined. Under Farahi's guidance, Islahi's days were filled with intense study, deep reflection, and spirited discussions. The classroom was not confined to four walls, lessons took place in the quiet hours before dawn, during long walks through the countryside, and in the stillness of night when the world slept and the mind was most receptive. Farahi did not simply impart knowledge, he taught his students how to think, how to see the divine wisdom woven into the very fabric of the Quran's language and structure. Islahi, with his innate curiosity and disciplined mind, absorbed these lessons like a desert absorbs rain. He learned to trace the subtle threads connecting one verse to another, to discern the overarching themes of each surah, and to appreciate the Quran's literary brilliance as a mirror of its spiritual depth. But this mentorship was about more than just intellectual rigor. Farahi instilled in his students a profound sense of spiritual responsibility. He believed that true understanding of the Quran required not only a sharp intellect but a purified heart. Tazkiyah, self-purification, and tafakkur, reflection, were two sides of the same coin. One could not fully grasp the Quran's message without embodying its ethics. This holistic approach left an indelible mark on Islahi. He began to see scholarship not as a means to prestige, but as a form of worship, a way of drawing closer to the divine. The hours he spent in study were also hours spent in introspection, in striving to align his character with the teachings he was unraveling. The bond between Farahi and Islahi transcended the conventional boundaries of teacher and disciple. Farahi saw in Islahi not just a student, but a successor, one who could carry forward his legacy and refine it for future generations. Islahi, in turn, revered Farahi not merely as an instructor, but as a spiritual guide, a man whose insight into the Quran was matched only by his humility and piety. Their relationship was one of mutual respect and deep affection, a rare and beautiful dynamic that shaped Islahi's approach to teaching in his later years. Tragically, this period of intense intellectual and spiritual growth was cut short by Farahi's passing in 1930. The loss was profound, not just for Islahi but for the entire community of scholars who had gathered around Farahi's vision. For Islahi, it was a moment of both sorrow and resolve. He had not only lost a teacher, he had lost a mentor, a guiding light. Yet, in that loss, he found a renewed sense of purpose. The mantle of Farahi's mission now fell upon his shoulders, and he accepted it with quiet determination. The years of apprenticeship were over, the time had come to step into his own role as a custodian of this transformative approach to the Quran. The intellectual formation Islahi underwent during these formative years became the foundation of everything that followed. Farahi's teachings on a Nazm-ul-Quran would later blossom into Islahi's magnum opus, Tadabur-e-Quran, a groundbreaking commentary that treated the Quran as a coherent, thematic whole. But more than that, the spiritual discipline he imbibed under Farahi's guidance shaped his entire worldview. He emerged from this period not just as a scholar, but as a seeker, one who understood that the Quran's true power lay not in theoretical knowledge alone, but in its ability to transform lives. Looking back, these years were the quiet yet seismic shift that set the course for Islahi's life. In the humble surroundings of Sari Mir, far from the noise of academic debates or political movements, a young man and his teacher had unlocked a new way of seeing the Quran. And though Farahi's physical presence was no more, his legacy lived on, in the pages of Islahi's works, in the hearts of his students, and in the enduring truth that the Quran, when approached with both mind and soul, reveals itself as an eternal guide, waiting to be understood anew by every generation. This was the essence of Islahi's journey during these pivotal years, a fusion of rigorous scholarship and profound spirituality, a marriage of intellect and faith that would define his legacy. It was here, under Farahi's watchful eye, that Amin Ahsan Islahi ceased to be just a student of the Quran and became, in every sense, its devoted interpreter and lifelong servant. Amin Ahsan Islahi's association with Jamaat-e-Islami and Islamic Revivalism. The years between 1941 and 1958 marked a pivotal chapter in Amin Ahsan Islahi's life, one that saw him step beyond the quiet halls of scholarship into the dynamic arena of Islamic revivalism. It was a time of great upheaval in the subcontinent. The winds of change were blowing as colonial rule waned, the struggle for independence reached its crescendo, and the question of what shape Muslim identity would take in a post-colonial world loomed large. Into this charged atmosphere stepped Syed Abul al-Maududi, a fiery intellectual whose vision for an Islamic renaissance was crystallizing into the formation of Jamaat-e-Islami. When Islahi joined the movement in 1941, he brought with him not just the weight of his scholarly credentials but the profound Quranic vision instilled in him by his mentor, Hamiduddin Farahi. For Islahi, this was not merely a political affiliation, it was an extension of his lifelong mission to revive the Quran's living message. He saw in Jamaat-e-Islami a platform through which the divine guidance could be translated into societal reform. His role within the organization was unique. While Maududi was the charismatic leader, the voice that rallied masses, Islahi became the intellectual anchor, the quiet force who provided theological depth to the movement's ideology. His contributions were most evident in the pages of Tarjuman-ul-Quran, the Jamaat's flagship journal, where his writings blended rigorous exegesis with urgent calls for spiritual and moral renewal. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Islahi avoided simplistic polemics. His articles were nuanced, rooted in the Quran's holistic worldview, and always emphasized the interconnectedness of faith, intellect, and action. Yet, this period was also one of quiet tension. Islahi's approach to Islamic revival was fundamentally different from Maududi's in subtle but significant ways. Where Maududi often framed the struggle in political terms, emphasizing the establishment of an Islamic state, Islahi's focus remained fixed on the deeper, more transformative work of Quranic understanding and spiritual purification. He believed that true change began not with capturing institutions but with reshaping hearts and minds through the Quran's guidance. This difference in emphasis, though rarely articulated publicly, created an undercurrent of divergence between the two thinkers. Islahi's years in Jamaat-e-Islami were thus a delicate balancing act. He was deeply committed to the cause of Islamic revival, yet increasingly aware that the movement's direction did not fully align with his vision of reform rooted in Quranic coherence and personal tazkiyah. The practical workings of the organization also chafed against Islahi's scholarly temperament. He was a thinker, a reflector, a man who thrived in the world of ideas rather than the hustle of organizational politics. The bureaucratic demands of party membership, the inevitable compromises of collective action, and the gradual shift toward political pragmatism all weighed heavily on him. By the mid-1950s, it became clear that his path and Jamaat-e-Islami's were diverging. The breaking point came in 1958, when, after nearly 2 decades of association, Islahi made the difficult decision to part ways with the movement he had helped build. This separation was not born of animosity but of profound intellectual and methodological differences. Islahi never repudiated the goals of Islamic revival. He simply came to believe that the work needed to be done differently, through sustained scholarly engagement with the Quran, through education rather than agitation, through the slow but sure transformation of individual consciousness. His departure marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, as he returned fully to the life of independent scholarship that would produce his magnum opus, Tadabburi Quran. Looking back on these 17 years, we see a man who walked the difficult line between idealism and pragmatism, between scholarly integrity and organizational loyalty. Islahi's time with Jamaat-e-Islami revealed both the possibilities and limitations of institutionalized Islamic reform. It honed his ability to articulate complex Quranic concepts for a broader audience, even as it reinforced his conviction that true change must grow organically from deep Quranic understanding. This period, though often overshadowed by his later scholarly achievements, was essential in shaping Islahi's mature thought, the crucible in which his unique blend of intellectual rigor and spiritual vision was tested and refined. What emerges most powerfully from these years is the consistency of Islahi's core belief that the Quran's transformative power lies not in its use as a political manifesto but in its capacity to reshape human beings from within. Even as he engaged with the pressing issues of his time, colonialism, nationalism, the crisis of Muslim identity, his gaze remained fixed on the eternal truths of the divine text. This unwavering focus on the Quran as the wellspring of guidance, rather than on any human institution or ideology, would become the hallmark of his legacy. The years with Jamaat-e-Islami were not a detour but a necessary passage in the journey of a scholar who sought, above all else, to bridge the timeless wisdom of revelation with the urgent needs of his age. Amin Ahsan Islahi's independent scholarship and major works. The moment Amin Ahsan Islahi stepped away from Jamaat-e-Islami in 1958 marked not an ending, but a profound new beginning. Freed from organizational constraints, he entered what would become the most intellectually fertile period of his life, a time when his decades of Quranic contemplation would blossom into monumental scholarly contributions that would redefine Islamic thought for generations. This was no retreat from the world, but rather a deeper engagement with the divine text that had always been his true compass. The air in his study must have carried a particular weight in those early days of independence, as Islahi sat surrounded by volumes of tafsir, hadith collections, and his own copious notes, the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of study now waiting to be distilled into something transformative. He had always been a man of quiet intensity, but now there was an added sense of urgency, as if he understood that the work before him was not just for his contemporaries but for centuries of Muslims yet unborn. The result would be Tadabburi Quran, his 9-volume magnum opus that would occupy nearly 2 decades of his life and stand as one of the most original Quranic commentaries of the modern age. What made Tadabburi Quran revolutionary was not just its content but its very approach. While traditional tafsirs often treated the Quran verse by verse, sometimes losing the forest for the trees, Islahi's work revealed the Quran as a carefully structured symphony of divine wisdom. Each surah unfolded as a coherent discourse, with themes developing logically from beginning to end. This wasn't dry scholarship, it was as if Islahi had discovered the living pulse of the Quran and now sought to share its rhythm with the world. His writing carried both the precision of a linguist dissecting Arabic roots and the wonder of a mystic beholding divine beauty. Readers didn't just understand the Quran better through his work, they experienced it anew. Yet Islahi was never one to lock himself in an ivory tower. Even as he worked on his tafsir, he established the Dawa Academy in Lahore, creating a space where his methodology could be taught to a new generation. His classroom sessions were legendary, not for dramatic lectures, but for the profound silence that would fall as students witnessed a mind completely immersed in Quranic reflection. He taught not just information but a way of seeing, training his students to recognize the subtle connections that wove the Quran into a unified whole. The 1970s and 80s saw this quiet scholar producing an astonishing array of works beyond his tafsir. His writings on hadith methodology challenged centuries-old assumptions, while his treatises on Islamic ethics brought Quranic principles into dialogue with contemporary challenges. What unified all these works was Islahi's distinctive approach, a blend of rigorous textual analysis and deep spiritual insight that refused to separate intellect from faith. He wrote with the conviction that the Quran's guidance wasn't trapped in the past but spoke directly to every age, if only one knew how to listen. Perhaps most remarkably, Islahi accomplished all this without the fanfare that accompanied many of his contemporaries. There were no international conferences bearing his name, no political platforms from which to declaim. His authority came not from institutional positions but from the weight of his ideas and the integrity of his character. In an era when Islamic discourse was becoming increasingly polarized between traditionalism and modernism, Islahi charted a third path, one that respected classical scholarship while fearlessly re-examining its assumptions through the lens of Quranic coherence. By the time the 1980s drew to a close, Amin Ahsan Islahi had become something rare in the Muslim world, a scholar whose influence grew quietly but inexorably, not through force of personality but through the undeniable power of his ideas. His works were being discussed in seminaries from Karachi to Cairo, his students were carrying his methodology to new audiences, and his vision of the Quran as an integrated, living guidance was reshaping how an entire generation approached Islam's sacred text. All this achieved not through institutional power or rhetorical flourish, but through the patient, painstaking work of a mind that had dedicated itself completely to unfolding the Quran's deepest secrets. This period of independent scholarship revealed the true essence of Islahi's life project, not to create followers, but to nurture understanding, not to defend tradition blindly, but to revive the Quran's transformative power for a new age. In his quiet study, through his voluminous writings, in the hearts of his students, he was rebuilding the connection between Muslim minds and their primary source of guidance, not as historical artifact, but as living revelation. The fruits of these decades would ensure that long after his voice fell silent, the Quran would continue to speak through the legacy of his work with ever-increasing clarity. Amin Ahsan Islahi's later years and enduring legacy. The twilight years of Amin Ahsan Islahi's life carried the quiet dignity of a setting sun that continues to illuminate the landscape long after it has dipped below the horizon. As the 1980s unfolded, the scholar who had spent 6 decades immersed in Quranic contemplation entered a phase that seemed to distill the very essence of his life's work into purer, more potent form. Now in his late 70s and early 80s, his physical strength gradually waned, but his intellectual vigor and spiritual luminosity only intensified, as if the proximity to eternity had sharpened his perception of divine truths. Those who visited him during these years in Lahore described an atmosphere of remarkable serenity in his modest home, where the walls lined with books seemed to hum with the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime's devotion. His eyes, though weakened by age, retained their penetrating quality, able to discern both the grammatical nuances of a Quranic phrase and the deepest yearnings of a student's heart. The once prolific pen moved more slowly now, but with greater precision, each word weighed carefully as he worked on refining his earlier works and penning final reflections. There was no rush, no anxiety to complete projects, only the measured rhythm of a man who had learned to synchronize his heartbeat with the timeless pulse of revelation. The remarkable aspect of Islahi's later years was how his influence continued expanding precisely as his physical world contracted. While his body became increasingly confined to his study and the nearby mosque, his ideas traveled far beyond those walls. The Dawah Academy he had established became a vibrant center of learning, attracting students from across the Muslim world who came to drink from the well of his unique Quranic methodology. These were not casual seekers but serious scholars who would go on to become professors, authors, and reformers in their own right, carrying the flame of his teachings to new generations. His magnum opus, Tadabbur-e-Quran, once considered revolutionary, was now being recognized as a classic of modern tafsir, its 9 volumes studied with reverence in seminaries and universities alike. What set Islahi apart in these final years was not just the content of his teachings but the manner in which he embodied them. Visitors expecting to meet a formidable intellectual were often surprised to encounter instead a man of extraordinary humility, whose scholarly achievement seemed to have only deepened his sense of being a perpetual student before the vast ocean of divine wisdom. His conversations rarely focused on his own works, but rather on the endless depths of the Quran that still awaited exploration. There was a palpable sense that for Islahi, even after 60 years of study, the Quran remained as fresh and inexhaustible as the first day he had encountered it under Farahi's guidance. The 90s brought the gradual dimming of his physical faculties, but his mind remained razor-sharp until the end. Younger scholars who came to discuss complex theological matters found his recall of Quranic verses and classical texts undiminished, his analytical powers as keen as ever. What had changed was the increasing simplicity of his expressions, as years of reflection had distilled profound truths into crystalline clarity. His final writings and lectures carried a quality of essential wisdom, the fruit of a lifetime spent not just studying the Quran, but living it, breathing it, allowing it to reshape his very being. When he passed away in 1997, the quiet departure of this unassuming scholar from Lahore belied the seismic impact his life had made on contemporary Islamic thought. Tributes poured in from across the Muslim world, not just from fellow academics but from ordinary believers whose understanding of the Quran had been transformed by his works. Yet perhaps the most fitting memorial was the continued flourishing of his intellectual legacy in the years that followed, the growing body of scholars applying his methodology, the new translations of his works reaching global audiences, the countless readers who found in his writings a key to unlock the Quran's living guidance. Today, decades after his passing, Amin Ahsan Islahi's presence endures most powerfully in the way serious students of the Quran engage with the sacred text. His insistence on thematic coherence has become part of mainstream Quranic studies, his holistic approach influencing new generations of thinkers across ideological spectrums. The man who spent his final years in quiet devotion has left behind a legacy that continues to reverberate through Islamic scholarship, proving that true intellectual revolutions are often born not in the clamor of public debate, but in the silent spaces where a devoted mind converses with divine revelation across the centuries. In the final analysis, Islahi's later years revealed the ultimate fruit of his life's journey, not just a new method of tafsir, but a living demonstration of what happens when a human being completely surrenders his intellect and soul to the Quran's transformative power. The books he left behind are not merely academic achievements but roadmaps of a journey he himself completed, from being a student of the word to becoming, in the most profound sense, its living embodiment. This quiet scholar from Azamgarh had discovered the secret that the Quran's miracles are not confined to its linguistic inimitability or historical predictions, but in its timeless capacity to reshape those who approach it with both scholarly rigor and humble devotion. His legacy, therefore, is not frozen in his writings but lives on in every seeker who follows his example, approaching the divine text as both an intellectual challenge and a spiritual lifeline, a guide for personal transformation before being a blueprint for societal change.